right. There we go. All right, another stream. Welcome back, everyone. All right, so this week, it's at the right time. All right, it didn't occur to me until after the last stream was over that I had done it a day early. I'm more settled in. I'm still transitioning to the new house, but for the most part, I feel like my head is more in it this week. So, yeah, so apologies to anyone who had wanted to attend last week's but didn't because I unceremoniously moved it up a day. But yeah, today we've got an interesting topic, right? I was asked to dive a little deeper into a piece that I just shared last week. Something that I'm calling We Persist. All right, so today we're going to go into it. We're going to listen to it for starters, and then we're going to try to explore just kind of the structure, what harmonic decisions I made, which orchestrational decisions I made, all that good stuff. I have already added the link to these notes in the description of this video. So if you want to, you can right-click on that and open in another tab. That way you don't leave the stream and you can follow along and ask any questions that you might have. This is going to be new territory. I've never actually dissected one of my pieces in front of anyone before. So if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to shoot them in the comments below. I would be more than happy to address any ideas that you guys have. But for now, let's kick things off by giving a quick listen to what we're going to be studying today. And there we have it. So let's start dissecting this piece. Let's see what kind of decisions I made, the structure, all that good stuff. And welcome to the chat, Matt. Thank you. Yeah, you're always on these, so thank you. Let's see here. All right, so let's pull up some notes. All right, because the first thing we should talk about is the overall structure. All right, the structure of this piece follows something very simple, actually. It's something that called simple binary form. All right. Simple binary form is one of the very first structures you're likely to learn as a music composition student. It's one of the most fundamental structures. It's essentially A-B form, all right? So what I have here is I have a theme A and a theme B. So for this structure, I do theme A, then I repeat theme A. All right? Then, after the theme A has been repeated, typically the traditional form for, say, on a piano is you have theme A, you play it, and then there's a repeat sign. It says, go back to the beginning, just play the entire thing over again, just the way it was. After that would come the B theme. All right, you would have a new theme, a contrasting theme. Typically, this is in a different key. It's got different characteristics. It's a new idea. And in simple binary form, after we've established the theme B, we simply repeat it. Again, you go back and repeat it. There's something called rounded binary form, which would go back to theme A, another variation of it. But that's not the structure I used for this one. So I essentially, for this entire thing, just have two basic ideas. In fact, let's pull up my sketch. I have this primary theme. Just a nice, simple 8-bar idea. And then after this is played once, I just repeat it and play the exact same thing. We don't need to listen to the whole thing. But then after this, it's literally just a copy and paste. All right? I just duplicated it. Now, after that, I would just go into theme B. Now, we can talk about the choices I made, how to modulate, how I wrote this theme, how it actually provides contrast to theme A. But then after theme B is established, which is this more kind of dramatic idea, it simply gets repeated again. And that's the general structure of the piece. This form is what helps give it shape, helps give it kind of a story, an idea to follow. And now we want to kind of start to dive into the more deeply how I actually wrote it. So as I mentioned, theme A, basically throughout this video, we're going to be tackling two things for each of these sections. We're going to tackle my chord progression and the choices I made harmonically. And then we're going to tackle my arrangement. How did I choose which instruments play what? How did I spread them across different registers? How did I choose a proper texture, etc.? Awesome. Some questions. So, Matt Lewis, what libraries are on this? Awesome. Yes. So I have essentially two libraries that I'm using. I'm using Spitfire Studio Strings Professional. And then for the initial solo statements, I'm using Spitfire Solo Strings. All right. And that's it. I mean, that's it. That's like, what, $1,000 worth of libraries? This is not a cheap hobby or profession. But I only use two libraries for this entire thing. And last week I showed some tips on how to get a little more life out of these libraries. And all string libraries for that matter. But yeah, it doesn't have to be all that complicated. Let's see here, and then Jack, I wish I could stay. I was really excited for this one when I saw it was about. Great pieces, always can't wait for the video. Thanks, Jack. All right, wish you could stay too, but we can always follow up in a lesson. Jack, as usual, is one of my students. So yeah, thanks for stopping by. But let's talk about the chord progression here. All right, so with theme A, it's kind of easier to break this particular theme down into two 4-bar phrases, even though the entire thing is one 8-bar phrase. Harmonically, to help kind of digest this a bit, let's split it in half. So let's give a quick listen to this idea again, just so it's fresh in our mind. All right, so this is what we're working with. It's a very simple idea, and right off the bat, a couple different things kind of stick out. The first is you'll notice I don't really have a bass line. I mean, technically, you could consider these bottom notes to be my de facto bass line, but I wanted to create a very intimate, soft feeling for this initial statement of the melody. And so I just kind of blurred the lines between what was chords and what was bass line. Now, in this chord progression, I've got these notes below. But you'll see that I have just 4 measures. I have 5 chords. So I have A minor in first inversion. Then I have E minor. Then I have B minor in second inversion. No, that's first inversion. The first chord was in second inversion. And then we do a D sus2 chord into a G sharp diminished. So there's a couple of interesting things I want to point out here. All right. Initially, first, A minor to E minor. Well, first thing, I use lots of inversions. You'll notice that A minor is in an inverted state. That is second inversion, meaning that the fifth is in the bottom. And then later on, I have B minor, which is in second inversion, or first inversion, which means that the third is in the bottom. Now, the reason why I did this is I wanted to create a very smooth bottom voice. I didn't want a whole lot of movement. And if I use the inversions, if I had not, then this bottom line would have had a lot more movement. Especially if I didn't do that inversion. But I didn't want all that movement. I didn't want a lot of movement in the chords. I didn't want a lot of movement in my background because I wanted all of it to fall back, to be very soft, very intimate, to really bring a lot more attention to the melody. And if the melody is the only layer that's really moving quite a bit, then it helps everything else just kind of fall into a more atmospheric stage. So I use these inversions specifically to create as flat of a bottom line as I could, as smooth leading as I could. I mean, I could technically have left the E, but that still would have added more movement if I had lifted that up. So instead, I've essentially just got two notes in my bottom line. So that's the first thing I want to point out. The second one is the relationship between these two chords here. I chose these two chords specifically to use something called a chord relationship. Now, I've covered chord relationships in a stream and a couple other videos. I've got a blog on my website you can check out. But the idea is that different chords in relationship to each other have been used so frequently that they kind of jump out as having an automatic emotional attachment. So I use this one specifically to get two minor chords separated by a perfect fifth, which creates a very tragic kind of sound. So if I had the A minor going into E minor, it has a very somber, very dark, kind of tragic, gut-wrenching sound. So that was the whole purpose of selecting these first two notes. After this, measure 3, I left the key. I used a borrowed chord. I used B minor. Now, the key of A minor doesn't have a B minor because the key of A minor doesn't have F sharp. This is supposed to be a B diminished if I really wanted to stick within the key. But instead, I used this B minor because the F sharp comes from A Dorian, which has a much more hopeful, a lot more kind of melancholy than straight up tragic sound. But at the same time, it still contains that same exact chord relationship of E minor to another minor chord, a perfect fifth away. Alright, so there's a couple different reasons why I did that. Now, right now, I'm starting to feel like I'm getting a little too technical. Alright, I'm feeling like I'm moving at a pace a little bit too quick. If any of you have any questions, please put them in the comments. Like I said, this is my first time actually doing like a theoretical analysis of all the decisions I made. If you want to follow along, please do. The notes are in the link below. But unless I get some questions, I'll just kind of keep plugging along. But the last interesting harmonic choice that I want to bring your attention in these first four measures is this very last measure. All right, so I wanted to build a lot of momentum. So we hear these first three measures. This is a very slow kind of somber sound. I wanted to start building a little bit more energy, which I do. And it starts to build energy. You can start to feel that tension, that momentum starting to build at this point because of three distinct strategies I used. All right, the first one, and most obvious, is I increased my harmonic rhythm. All right, I increased the number of chords per measure. Anytime you increase the number of chords per measure, your energy goes up. Anytime you reduce the number of chords per measure, so example, if I had used one chord per two measures, then that would result in a decrease in energy. But that's not the only thing I did. The next thing I did was I used a suspended 2 chord, which is this A suspended 2 right here. Now, technically, you could say that this is, A suspended 4. So D suspended 2. So that kind of explains what I was saying. This could either be a D sus 2 or because of the same exact notes, you could say it's an A sus4. Doesn't really matter which one you want to go with. This is where it starts to get into semantics of how you name your chords. I'm going with D sus2 just because the D is in the bottom voice, the bottom note. But a sus chord has a lot of tension. It desperately wants to resolve. Specifically, a sus chord wants to resolve by moving the second or fourth back into a third. So this D sus2 wants to take that E and move it up to F. Let's raise that an octave so we can hear it a bit more clearly. We could also do, if it was a sus4, you can kind of hear a little bit of that. It's a little more clear when it's a major chord. Minor chords don't have quite as strong of a resolution, but it still helps build a little bit of momentum. Now the idea is that's the default way a sus chord wants to resolve. A suspended chord, no matter what type it does, wants to resolve. It wants to kind of fix the energy by moving that middle note, by taking the one note causing all the issues and changing it. All right, in this case, our middle note is the D. We have an A, technically it depends. Again, I'm a little. If I wanted this to be an A sus4, let's say it's an A sus4 because that way it's the middle. All right, so we've got the A sus4, we've got the D here. Typically, we'd want to resolve this by moving it down like that. But instead, what we do is we take both of these notes and we move them. We take the other two and resolve A to B, E to G sharp. So this is a deceptive resolution of a sus chord, which helps build the momentum. And of course, we're using a secondary diminished here, which again is something I've talked about in a previous short theory video. But the idea is I'm taking a chord from out of my key, and I want this to resolve from G sharp diminished to A minor. So I take my target chord, which is going to be the A minor in measure 5, and I just build the diminished triad a half step below it. And that helps build a lot of momentum, leading us right into it. So again, I don't usually like getting so technical on this channel, because there's a whole lot of stuff I'm running through. If you have any questions about this arrangement, about the music, about harmony in general, let me know. But those are essentially the ideas here that had the biggest pull, that had the biggest influence on these first 4 measures. So let's kind of move on to the next 2. All right, so we'll listen to this together. You can hear how these first 3 chords really help bring kind of a somber, tragic sound to it. And then this 4th measure is going to help build momentum and energy, launching us right into this first chord. So here we're going to do something very similar in these next 4 measures. The first one is these first 2 chords are the same CR, but they're a twin. All right, so I talked about how 2 minor triads separated by a perfect 5th have a very tragic sound. This particular chord relationship has a twin. Now, when a chord relationship has a twin, it means you invert it. So a perfect 5th, when you invert it, becomes a perfect 4th. If we take 2 minor triads separated by a perfect 5th, and then we take 2 minor triads separated by a perfect 4th, that's an inverted CR, and in this case, they have the same emotion. Now, again, if you want to learn more about this, I have this blog post and a video that go into it. But the idea here is that the 2 minor triads separated by a perfect 5th do have a twin, and that is 2 minor triads separated by a perfect 4th. Like I said, there's theory behind this. You don't necessarily need to know that theory. All you need to know is that these 2 CRs have the same basic emotional feeling, the same emotional idea. So what I did here is I swapped it. I used the twin to create the same emotional feeling while still at the same time adding a little bit of variety. So it's not just a complete repetition. After that, essentially, I followed the same idea. My last 2 measures are designed to build momentum, to launch me into the next phrase. What I did for that is, again, I increased my harmonic rhythm. So now I have 2 chords per measure instead of 1. I start with the A minor, and then I went to a sus chord again. Once again, I resolved that deceptively into the 5 chord, which then I add the 7th to create the functional tritone that we've talked about before, which is going to launch us right back to A minor. That was all really technical. All right? So I feel like if you feel lost, don't worry. There's still a lot more that we can cover. In particular, we'll start talking about the arrangement and the instruments I chose. That's not quite as technical. But if you do have any questions about any of this stuff, please let me know. I am more than happy to kind of go a little bit deeper into all of it. Again, the notes are in the description of this video, so you can download them. But for now, let's start talking about the texture and arrangement. All right, first, for the first 4 measures, I knew right away that this arrangement needed to grow. I wanted to create this kind of epic, tragic piece. All right, not so much the intimate sadness, but more of like the massive tragedy type sound. Now, in order to get that kind of epic, grand scale of tragedy, you need to have growth, consistent growth. And in order to grow in your music, you need to have a starting point that allows growth. If I had started with a massive sound right off the bat, there's not much further I can go to make that bigger. So instead, I wanted to start incredibly intimate with this first kind of phrase. So I went with one of the most intimate textures I could think of, which is predominantly a solo performer. So here we have a solo viola. Then in the accompaniment, I have divisi violins. Now violins, or divisi, means that I'm dividing the section in half. All right, so in my general kind of default violin 2 section, I have 12 violins. I didn't want to use all 12 and then have to rely on the 16 first violins. I felt that was too big right off the bat. So I said, I'm going to take these 12, I'm going to divide them in half, having 6 violins each, and they're going to play the chords. Underneath that, I have a full cello section playing very softly on my kind of bass line. All right, which again, the bass line here is very, very closely related to the chords. All right, they're not separated by all that much. And it also doesn't move too terribly much. Especially when you add the melody to the mix, you see that this is pretty tight-knit. All of this is happening within 2 octaves. And when you have all that combined, small number of instruments, very small amount of space being used, it helps create a very intimate setting for this initial statement. All right, let's pull these up. All right, so from here, after having kind of the pulsing chords, just long enough to provide a bit of harmonic context, I helped grow by eventually moving my basses, my cello down a bit lower, adding a bit more movement to help establish the bass line as a little more independent from the chords. And I started sustaining the chords for their full length. Here there's still some movement. In the upper violin, in the violins, I'm not having them just sustain one chord for the first measure. I'm having them switch chordal tones, so there's still a bit of movement. But now you can actually hear physically that the sound is taking up more space because there's no longer these pauses in the arrangement. We're also getting a bit louder. And at this point, I also doubled the melody an octave higher in a solo violin, which you can't hear because it's muted. Hamzy, welcome to the chat. Welcome to the stream. So, to kind of recap the arrangement here, my main idea was I knew this music needed to grow. And in order to grow, I needed to start at a very intimate bass level, very intimate bass line. So I started with very soft accompaniment and a very intimate solo melody. Now, to help grow that in the second half of the phrase so that it still feels dynamic, like I'm not just sticking at one texture, I then doubled the octave by adding a solo violin and started having the chords sustained a bit longer, playing through the full measure instead of pulsing. I also added a bit more dynamic movement to the bass line where the cello, instead of just playing in one octave, is starting to do play the original note, then drop an octave. Oops. And kind of add that movement. So what we're doing is we're adding energy by expanding into more instruments, adding energy by expanding to longer notes, and adding more movement in the bass line. All right, so from here, we kind of moved on to the repetition. So remember when I talked about how this is simple binary form, all right? So we have theme A, it gets played, that's what we just went over. Then theme A gets repeated again. So this is the same exact material, same chord progression, same melody, so we don't need to go through all of that again. But I still need to find a way to make it sound more interesting. I wanted to build, again, this idea of constant growth throughout this piece. And so for me, the next natural step for that was to create a more complex texture. So what I did is I dropped the chord plus melody type approach. I got rid of the homophonic approach. And I went to more of a polyphonic, which means counterpoint. So I have the original melody now being played in first violins. Then I have a counterpoint line being played by the violas. And then a second counterpoint line being played by the cello. All of this is technically smaller. We have fewer voices playing than we previously did. But because there's a lot more movement, there's a lot more energy. So it feels like it's larger. So if we start back here, then we move into the repetition of theme A, we're going to feel it gets larger. There's a lot more movement going on. So there's higher energy. Arrive right back at theme B. All right, so let's talk about theme B for a little bit. Anytime you add a new thematic idea, anytime you introduce a new melodic idea to your music, it is incredibly important to make sure that you introduce it in a way that your audience can immediately become familiar with it. So since this is a new idea, I needed to make sure that the accompaniment was very simple and that the melody really got hammered home. To do this, I doubled the melody in octaves. So first we have the cello and the first violins are playing this in octaves together. Next, we have the violins and violas are performing kind of a chordal accompaniment. But the violas, if you'll notice, are also helping to double the melody again using orchestral resonance. Now, I've talked about orchestral resonance in previous videos. The idea is you play a note being performed in the melody, but when the melody moves on, you just hold that note. So if we solo the violas and the cello, we're going to hear this effect that's almost a little reminiscent of the... Let's make sure it's only the violas and cello up here. It's almost reminiscent a little bit of a piano sustain pedal. it's a subtle effect, but it got the kind of color I was looking for. It helped to emphasize my melody a little bit by emphasizing those strong notes. And then, of course, there's the bass line playing underneath it, but because I wanted to focus on establishing this new theme, all of the accompaniment other than perhaps second violins and the bass line helped to really underline this new idea. Now, like I said, this theme B usually has to be a contrasting theme when working in simple binary form, meaning it has to provide something new. One of the simplest ways to do this is to switch keys. All right, so this piece up to the point has been in the key of A minor. Then suddenly, at the theme B, we leap into a new key of F sharp minor. Now, the way I did this is I used the very last chord in measure 16, which is an E dominant 7, which, as we know from previous videos, wants to resolve to A minor. But you can use a deceptive resolution to resolve up to F sharp minor instead, which is what I did here. I used it as a half cadence to deceptively launch from E major, E dominant 7, and have that lead into F sharp minor, which then kickstarted a new key for us. Now, if you aren't familiar with the idea of deceptive cadences, I'd recommend checking out my short theory video about cadences. It's like, I think 3 minutes tops, and it goes in detail on the different cadences, how you build them, how you use them, and where you might find them to be most useful. So that's one way that this kind of changes. It offers contrast, something kind of a little bit of a contrasting idea, contrasting energy, is it's a new key. But another way it does this is a relatively simple chord progression compared to the previous one. If we look at this, there aren't really any borrowed chords. Everything fits in the key. We aren't using any specific secondary diminished. We're not using any sus chords. It's all pretty straightforward. Other than a few inversions to help get the bass line I wanted, there's nothing special to write home about this particular chord progression. It's a lot more simple, a lot more direct, a lot more straightforward, which helps, again, provide a bit more contrast. Also, if we look at the melody, we'll see that the melody here is also, again, much simpler. Over here in this primary melody, theme A, we move around a lot more. We have mostly quarter notes, several eighth notes, even a couple 16th notes. But here in theme B, it's mostly half notes. The most common note being used throughout theme B is a half note, whereas the most common note being used in theme A is a quarter note. Now, these are all just different ways that I helped make sure that the two were different from each other. Now, in terms of arrangement, we already talked about how I arrived and helped make sure that this new theme gets underlined and gets a little more focused. We did that by getting a much more simple texture. Instead of counterpoint, it was just melody and octaves, some chords, and a bass line. Then, to get a much more dramatic feel for the arrangement, I split into many, many more voices. So you'll notice I went from a full violin section of 16 to having the violins split in half. 8 of them play the melody in one octave, 8 of them play the melody in another octave. I did the same with the violins. One is performing a bit of chordal accompaniment. The other is, again, playing the melody in a third octave. Violas are playing an embellished variation of the melody, which means they're still playing the melody, with still hitting all of the most important notes, but it's also adding some notes in between. So we're still hitting each important note, F sharp here, C sharp there, D, B, but in between we're adding a couple notes that bridge them together. This makes it an embellishment of the primary melody, but again, it's still performing the melody. Then finally, the celli are once again playing the melody, and the basses have the bass line in octaves. So what this does is we've got all of these different voices playing the melody across 4 different octaves. And in addition to this, we have the basses going lower than the bass line has gone before, which gives extra weight and power. Anytime you move lower in a register in your music, it adds both weight and power to your sound. And the violins are also moving much higher than we have gone before, which anytime you move into a higher register, it adds extra energy and tension as well as size to your music. And so when we add all of these together, oops, that's the piano, we get a very dramatic sound. So if we were to mute the basses, we hear how it kind of loses some of its presence when we mute the lowest and highest registers. Now, after this, I've kind of hit the climax at this point. Everything is being played in octaves. There's not much larger I can go, but I still want to push the energy further. So if I can't move into a wider, larger arrangement, one way I can do that is by adding more color. So if I listen here, you can hear how it suddenly becomes much richer in texture. And the reason why is I've actually changed the texture. Some of these voices that were previously performing the melody in octaves are now doing something called a chordal texture, which means they're playing the same rhythm. All right, they're still playing the identical rhythm to the melody, but they're playing different notes. Specifically, they're playing notes that are found in the underlying chord progression. So if we take a look at my notes here, because I can't remember which specific instruments it is. Let's see. First more. Oh, yeah, here we go. We have... here, I'll pull these up so you guys can see what I'm looking at. The last four measures, I use a chordal texture. Oh, and I did not put down the specific instruments. That's annoying. So let's just figure it out, shall we? All right, so the melody is F sharp. So we've got violin 1A and violin 1B are both playing the melody. Violin 2B is playing the melody. And that's it. Which means we have violin 2A, the violas, and the celli are all playing a chordal texture. Again, the violas here are embellishing, so they're not playing an identical rhythm, but they're still adding additional chordal notes. And when we take the melody performed in octaves and we add a chordal texture to it, it creates a much richer, much more kind of energetic sound. Start with the octaves. Now this right here, this dramatic pause at the end is actually something I got asked quite a bit about in the comments when I first shared this piece. And was the idea is like, how did I create that? The first arrangement I did of this, that pause did not work nearly as well. It's because I didn't emphasize the tension enough. The golden rule of orchestration is that if you're going to create a pause, if you're going to use silence in your music, whatever amount of energy was being used in the music directly before that silence is however much energy is going to be found in that silence, if that makes sense. So the idea is I created a lot of attention right here. I did this by making sure my functional tritone, which I've talked about with dominant chords before, between the third and the seventh. So we've got a C sharp dominant here. And I gotta make sure that I'm on the piano. C sharp dominant. We'll go back here. You know what? No, let's just leave it. Open that up. So we've got C sharp dominant here. So the third and seventh scale degree between C sharp dominant are going to create a tritone. So we have F and B form a tritone between each other. This is an incredibly dissonant interval. Now, normally, if you've watched my videos on orchestrating chords, you'd want to make sure that the third and seventh of any chord are not represented as frequently as any other scale degree, as the first or fifth. But in this one, they all have equal representation. The first scale degree is being played in octaves by the basses, two voices playing the root. The third, which is technically an E sharp, but in Q bass it comes off as an F natural, is again played in two voices, the celli and the violins. The B, which is the, or G sharp, which is the 5th, is again played by 2 voices. And then B, which is our 7th, is again played in 2 voices. So everything is given equal representation, which helps really emphasize that tension in the sound. I've really kind of made sure that the 3rd and 7th, which form that tritone, have a very strong presence. So that creates a ton of tension, which gets carried over into the silence. You can almost think of silence in music as being kind of like a canyon. All right, if you don't have enough momentum leading into it, you're not going to reach the other side. If you do, you're going to get launched all over the cannon, and you'll be able to survive that little drop, that little bit of nothingness, and still have energy to arrive at the other side. Resolve it with the 1 chord. All right, so that's that. That was the very first time I've ever kind of broken down one of my own pieces before. This is what was requested for this week's live stream. If you have any questions, please let me know. We got done a little bit early. I'd love to spend some time talking about whatever you want to talk about. If not, I'm going to listen to the whole thing one more time to kind of like buy some time between the lag between me talking and when you see the stream. We'll listen to it. If there's any questions, I'll answer them. If not, we'll just kind of call it early today. As usual, you can find all of these notes in the link in the description of this video. For homework, since I didn't really teach anything new, just the usual. Send me some comments, all right? Let me know, what is it you want to see me cover next week? Is there anything about harmony, anything about orchestration? Let me know, all right? I'd be happy to cover any topic of music you'd like to dive into. But for now, let's listen to it one more time, and then we'll see if there's any questions. And there we have it. All right. We got one comment. Aaron, I'm still learning and catching up. Some of this is still over my head, but I'll get it eventually. I would like to learn more about modulation in an upcoming lesson. Thanks for lessons. My pleasure. And definitely, that is incredibly true. You will eventually get all of this. All right. And sure, next week, the topic will be modulation. I am more than happy to do that. There are a ton of really fun strategies for how to take one key and leap right into another one, whether you set it up or don't. We'll talk about the 2 different basic types of modulation, which is kind of pivot modulation, where you kind of move it, and then more of a transitional modulation, where the audience is keenly aware that you're changing tonal center as you do it. They're both lots of fun. We'll talk about a bunch of strategies for it. It sounds like a good time. All right, so yeah, next week. I'm excited now. Thank you to everyone who stopped by the stream. Thank you to everybody who stopped by afterwards. As usual, you can find the notes to this in the link at the description below. If you have any comments, any questions, any thoughts, please shoot them my way. I'd be more than happy to address them. If you're interested in personal lessons, personal private lessons, link is below. I have enough room for a few more students, not too many. My plate's pretty full. I think I got like 9 students at the moment. I think I could max out at about 11. So if you're interested, let me know. Lessons are customized to your level, to your areas of interest, all that good stuff to make sure that they are as unique and individualized to you as possible. So until next time, my friends, keep studying, keep working hard, and keep writing new music. I will see you all in the next video. Have a great day. Bye-bye.